Andrew, thank you so much for joining us on The Hub today. I really appreciate it.
Good to be with you.
This year is the 60th anniversary of renowned Canadian philosopher George Grant's seminal work, Lament for a Nation. It is an emotional critique of American dominance in this country. It touches on a fear that we've had since the 1800s, this fear of being swallowed up by the Americans as it relates to business, as it relates to culture, etc., and whether maybe we've already been swallowed and are being digested currently. How do you look back on 60 years since this book was written and that relationship between us and our neighbors to the south?
Well, it's been a long time since I read it, but my recollection of it was it wasn't just a critique of America or America's relationship with Canada. It was a critique of the modern world. His ideal was a pre-industrial society. And the lament part, the pessimism of the book, was his acknowledgement that there wasn't any real solution to that we were perforce part of modernity and therefore part of the American empire as being the sort of leading country of modernity. I don't want to retreat into a pre-industrial society. I think modernity has many virtues. So his critique to me, you said emotional, and I would say not really rooted in anything pragmatic or achievable. I mean, one of the measures was his hero was Diefenbaker. It takes a lot of work, it seems to me, to erect John Diefenbaker as some kind of tribune of any kind of serious Canadian nationalism or of a critique of modernity. He was a kook, is what he was. So I find it hard to take the book seriously in that light. It became the Bible for a lot of left-wing Canadian nationalists from the 60s on and sort of red Tories, which to me just shows how often socialism can actually be quite conservative. A lot of socialism is rooted in a hungering for a simpler society that didn't have the kind of impersonal relationships that market economies make possible. These distant relationships with people we never have anything to do with. A lot of it has you can hear this kind of echo of wouldn't it be better if we still lived in villages and didn't have these complexities?
So for you, what are the outlines that make a Canadian conservative in modern day times that maybe distinguish them from an American one?
A Canadian conservative, let me pause and I'll come back to that, but I think a Canadian nationalist, I'm a Canadian nationalist, but I'm a nationalist of a certain kind. I'm a nationalist that says it's better that we remain a large country rather than several small countries. It's better that we should be, finding force in numbers and doing greater things and achieving greater things and aspiring to greater things rather than hiving off and being ourselves alone. Mine is a nationalism that says it's not about being different from other countries. It's about being the best country that we can be. We're very similar to the Americans because we're next door to them, because we're part of the North America, because we're a modern mortgage-holding bourgeois society. We're going to inevitably be very similar to them, and we shouldn't worry about that. You
shouldn't worry at all. There's no fears.
I see no reason at all to make difference an objective in its own right. What I would say we should want to be is we're a liberal democratic country. Let's be the best example of a liberal democratic country we can be. Let's be more fair, more just, more democratic, more competitive, all these things that most countries around the world, most democratic countries aspire to be.
So we should try to beat them as opposed to differentiate ourselves.
That's right. Anytime you get into the difference game, first of all, it's a dead end. It leads you astray from what ought to be your objective, which is being the best society you can be. It leads you to be fetishizing difference. Therefore, it means you've got to create and enlarge upon differences that may or may not exist. So you create these stereotypes of America and stereotypes of Canada, the better to emphasize how different they are, which means, of course, you wind up overlooking differences within each society. And in fact, the differences between the Deep South and the Northwest are as large as any difference between Canada and America. The differences between Quebec and Western Canada are as large as anything between Canada and the United States. So it winds up homogenizing differences within each country and exaggerating the differences between the countries, and therefore, of course, leaves you vulnerable. If you've hoisted your flag on the idea that differentness is the only thing that matters, what do you say when a Quebec comes along and says, well, wait a minute, we're different from you?
We're more different.
If difference is all, then let's get serious about it, right? It's a little late at that point to turn around and say, oh, come on, there's more to life than being different. So let's have a nationalism that's rooted in what draws us together rather than what drives us apart. What can we achieve together? What can be our purpose as a country? That's going to be a short list because people are going to have all kinds of individual things. But that's the irony in what I'm saying is the Americans got a lot of this right. That at least, up until recently, they're going through some real problems now rooted in Donald Trump and what he represents. But the ordinary idea, the historic idea of America was that it was all about the Constitution, that anybody could be an American as long as they basically subscribe to this short list of principles. That's a very powerful idea. That's what's called civic nationalism. And we can partake of it. That was very much a part of the idea of the Charter of Rights. Was to give every Canadian a common set of rights.
Some could say we might have copied them in some ways.
And that's right, and in some ways we did things better than them. I think I'm not a fan of the notwithstanding clause. I am a fan of the reasonable limits clause. I think the reasonable limits clause has saved us from some of the Supreme Court craziness that they've suffered from in the United States. So yeah, we came along later and did some things better than them. Great, that's the way it's supposed to work. But we didn't do it just to be different. We did it because people said, this is a better way to write your Charter of Rights than has previously been attempted.
Just a couple more questions for you. So what's running through your head when Canadian governments, whether they be conservative, liberal, are taking steps to have the state make protections as it relates to Canadian culture, Canadian business, so that there is that line, reinforcing that border between the U.S. and Canada, protecting what's ours, et cetera? What do you make of that?
I've always thought it's got it back to front. The policy that governments pursue is supposed to come out of the culture rather than policy dictating the culture. If we're different from the United States, and obviously there's some differences, there will inevitably be difference, those will manifest themselves anyway in the culture that we produce. And it seems to me to be peculiarly defensive to say, unless we have this ribbon or the steel wall of cultural protections, that these same differences that we think are in and of themselves sufficient to justify our separate nationhood, they'll just wither away instantly. Have a little more faith in your fellow Canadians, that let them make their own choices and decide their own cultural destiny, rather than having somebody in a bunker somewhere making these decisions based upon some project, some political project that's rooted again in difference for difference's sake. The thing is, when you start getting into the weeds of these arguments about cultural nationalism, it's never clear exactly what they mean. Is it about art or is it about politics? And usually they'll say, oh no, it's not about politics, it's about art. Well, there's no aesthetic principle that says it's better for Canadians to read Canadian stories that tell them how Canadian they are. That's a political project. And it's dismaying to me that a couple of generations of artists kind of willingly signed up for this project to be kind of avatars of Canadian statehood. I don't think that's, particularly if you're doing it as part of a government policy and being subsidized to do it. It seems to me a very strange role for artists to take on. So no, I've never been a fan of cultural nationalism. I think it's a series of self-contradictions that's really held us back, and it's been responsible for a lot of really mediocre cultural expression. If you look at popular music, there are a number of names in popular music, Canadian names, that are revered today. The kids today are still listening to them 60, 70 years later. So, Joni Mitchell, Leonard Cohen, Neil Young, the Guess Who, a few names like that. All of them predate CanCon. CanCon comes in the early 70s, and what do you get? You get what economic theory would predict. You get a bunch of mass market artists for a small audience. So you get kind of the Glass Tigers, the sort of 80s groups, and none of it's lasted. And mercifully, the internet's come along, and most of those cultural protections, at least in that sector, have become irrelevant. People can listen to whatever music they want to listen to. And lo and behold, we're producing some great Canadian international artists again. So I think CanCon was a terrible dead end, and we should never have gone down it.
So how do you view the 60s in Canada? In 1967 was the 100th anniversary of the country. Grant looks back on this and sees, you mentioned sort of decisions around nuclear warheads being placed on Canadian soil as being what is like the death knell of the Canadian nation. Has Canada lost anything since then? How should we view that period in time, comparing then to now?
That's an interesting question. We've lost a certain naivete, probably. That's inevitable. That's part of growing up. We've gained a lot of things as well. I think we're a more interesting, diverse country now, and I think there's a real power in that. That really does reinforce this idea that what draws us together is what we believe in, and not the color of our skin or our birth heritage. I think that's a powerful idea. I think that it ultimately is going to draw us closer together, and I think there's a lot of evidence of that. We were in a real, people think we're divided now. We had some real problems back in the 60s in terms of French-English divisions, for example. But what's interesting is as time goes on, divisions that seemed at one point to be vast and unbridgeable are surmounted. Back in the days of Confederation, the thing they were most proud of was they'd been able to surmount the divisions between Protestant and Catholic, or between English and Scottish, or English and Irish. Yes. Right? There was kind of a latter-day template that was put over that. It was all about English and French. That was only one of many divisions that they thought were huge and unbridgeable back in the day that now look to us quite quaint. And I would submit that some of the divisions that people talk about today, about race, et cetera, 100 years from now are probably going to seem quaint as well. And by and large, I think it's been an enormous success. Precisely because it's so diverse. If there was only sort of two groups in any society, if there's only two groups that are kind of looking at each other across one divide, that can really cause problems. But when it's many different groups, it's harder for people to kind of mount the barricades, and people are more inclined, I think, to start to see the similarities and commonalities between them. We're a much larger country than we were in 1967. We have almost exactly twice the population. I think that's a good thing. I'm one of those who'd like to see us with 100 million people by the end of the 21st century, which, by the way, only requires that we keep growing at the rate we've been growing for the last 75 years. But at a time when other countries are shrinking, I think it's kind of a cool idea. If you look at the projections, if we're at 100 million in 2100, we'll be the second largest country in the G7.
But certainly not at the rates we've seen over the last few years.
Oh, the last couple of years, they lost control of a couple of programs. Okay, the temporary foreign workers and the international students. So it ballooned up to 2 or 3%, which, by the way, we grew at that rate in some years in the 50s and 60s, and we didn't have anything like the problems we have now. The problems we have now is not because we have too many people. It's because we have too little capital. It's because we have an absolutely hamstrung medical system.
Transportation system, housing system.
Yeah, so rapid population growth has exposed some of the flaws. They've increased the costs of flawed systems. Well, lo and behold, we're making more progress in fixing those systems in the last year than we have in the 20 years prior to that. We're having serious discussions about deregulating housing that we never had before. And why? Because they had a little population boost that kind of made the cost more apparent. Yeah. So fix your system, get your investment rates up, get your investment rate in housing up. We're building the same number of houses now that we did in 1967. That's crazy. So I'm ranging far afield from your original answer.
Anyway, let's see if those discussions lead to action. And it's a fun time to look back 60 years ago. Thank you so much for joining us, Andrew.
My pleasure.